Good evening, community. It is a true pleasure to be with you once again, bringing you the most macabre and terrifying stories that reach us every week. If you would like to send in your story, our email is in the video description. We thank each person who continues to share their stories with us. Now, I invite you to turn off the lights and put on your headphones if you can. The most important thing is for you to let yourself be carried away by the upcoming stories.
The mansion, with its ancient walls and narrow windows, was shrouded in a deep silence. Inherited from a distant relative, the imposing structure stood isolated, surrounded by trees whose twisted branches seemed to form a natural barrier. The couple, excited about their new life, began to explore the house steeped in history, though there was a slight unease in the air. During one of these explorations, they decided to venture into the attic, a place untouched for decades. The air was heavy, and the space was filled with stacked boxes and furniture covered in dust-laden sheets. In a dark corner, a large object draped with a cloth caught their attention. When they uncovered it, they revealed an old portrait of a young woman with a disturbingly intense gaze, almost lifelike. Her deep blue eyes seemed to follow every movement, creating a sense of both discomfort and fascination. The man, with his black hair, was intrigued, admiring the precision and detail of the painting, feeling drawn to the portrait as if it held some hidden secret. His wife, however, felt a growing unease, as though something was profoundly wrong with the image. Despite her reservations, they decided to hang the portrait in the main room, where the man frequently admired it, while his wife avoided looking directly into the woman's eyes. As time passed, the portrait began to exert a strange influence over the house and the couple. The woman in the painting, with her penetrating gaze and enigmatic smile, seemed to be waiting to fulfill an ancient destiny, while the mansion, once a peaceful refuge, started to reveal its dark secrets, one whisper at a time. The atmosphere in the mansion changed after the discovery of the portrait. The man with black hair, initially intrigued, became obsessed with the figure of the woman in the painting. He spent hours in front of the portrait, admiring every detail as if he were being drawn by an invisible mystery. His wife, on the other hand, felt an increasing discomfort. The woman's eyes in the portrait unsettled her, as if there were something sinister about the image. As the days went by, the man's obsession with the portrait grew. He distanced himself more and more from his wife, spending long periods in the room, speaking softly to the painting. The wife began to have nightmares about the woman in the painting, dreams where the figure came to life and wandered through the house. Objects in the mansion started to move on their own, and the air around the portrait was always colder. The tension in the house was mounting. The husband seemed increasingly distant, almost as if he were under a spell. One night, the wife woke to the sound of footsteps and found her husband in a trance, standing before the portrait, conversing with the figure in the painting. When she called out to him, he looked at her with a strange expression, as if she were a stranger in her own home. The portrait, with its penetrating eyes and enigmatic smile, had become the center of an obsession that threatened to destroy the couple. The woman in the painting seemed to gain more life with each passing day, while the wife felt she was losing the man she loved to a malevolent presence she could not understand but knew was dangerous. The mansion, once a refuge, was transforming into a dark and threatening place, dominated by the mysterious figure in the portrait. Time in the mansion was running out, and the atmosphere had become a battleground between the wife and the entity in Isabel's portrait. Determined to save her husband, who was increasingly submerged in Isabel's malignant influence, the wife discovered through a diary that Isabel had cast a curse before her death, trapping her spirit in the portrait and condemning those who gazed upon it. Desperate, the wife found an ancient ritual to attempt to free her husband. On the decisive night, she performed the ritual, surrounding the portrait with candles and herbs, and reciting the incantation. Isabel's portrait seemed to come to life, and the mansion shook under the oppressive energy, but the wife persisted until a supernatural scream from Isabel filled the room, and the malignant energy retreated. The husband, freed from the spell, was confused but alive. Although the ritual worked temporarily, the wife knew that Isabel's threats still existed. Determined to leave the mansion and the portrait behind, she felt that Isabel's curse could still follow them. As they left the mansion, the wife took one last look at the portrait, feeling Isabel's silent fury, as if the entity were waiting for its next chance for revenge. The transformation of the black-haired man was evident. He who had once been full of life, now seemed like a shadow of himself, consumed by an obsession with the portrait of a woman. He spent hours in front of the painting, murmuring words as if the woman were real, and increasingly isolated himself in the room where the portrait was hung. The wife, desperate, watched as her husband drifted further from reality, fixated on the disturbing image. The mansion began to change in alarming ways. Objects moved, whispers echoed through the halls, and the presence in the portrait became almost tangible. Fearing for her husband's sanity, the wife investigated the history of the portrait and discovered that the woman in the painting was a distant relative who had died in a violent and mysterious manner. The painting was cursed, trapping the troubled soul of the woman, who now drained the energy and sanity of the black-haired man. When the wife tried to confront her husband with these findings, he reacted with anger, denying everything and insisting that the woman in the portrait was real and needed him. The supernatural phenomena in the house intensified, and the wife, desperate, knew she needed to act quickly to save her husband, but feared he might already be lost forever, trapped under the malignant influence of the portrait. Tension in the mansion reached its peak, with the husband temporarily free from the portrait's influence, but the wife knew they needed to act quickly to escape Isabel's power. Desperate, she decided to destroy the portrait, fearing that the curse might intensify. Armed with a knife, she confronted the painting but was repelled by an invisible force. Shadows in the room began to move, and Isabel seemed to come to life, laughing maliciously as the wife struggled against the entity. Determined, the wife turned to a ritual she had found in the attic. She recited an incantation in hopes of containing Isabel. The shadows hesitated, but the struggle grew fiercer. With one final effort, the wife threw herbs over the portrait, completing the incantation. The portrait trembled, Isabel's image distorted, and the painting split in half, shattering into pieces. Although the malignant energy dissipated, the wife felt that Isabel's spirit was still present. Exhausted, she left the room, knowing that while the portrait was destroyed, Isabel's story was not over, and the mansion would no longer be her home. The destruction of the portrait brought only temporary relief, as the wife knew that Isabel was still present in the mansion. Although the husband was slowly recovering, he remained haunted by what he had experienced. The wife, ever vigilant, began to sense Isabel's presence more intensely, realizing that Isabel had not departed and continued to seek communication. One night, the wife felt a presence beside her and was drawn to the room where the portrait had once been. There, she heard whispers and realized that Isabel was seeking redemption, not revenge. Understanding that Isabel needed help to find peace, the wife made the difficult decision to sacrifice herself to free the spirit. Reciting a different incantation, not to banish Isabel but to release her, the wife felt her life slipping away. By dawn, the husband found the mansion in silence, the portrait destroyed and the wife missing. Realizing the sacrifice she had made, he left the mansion, knowing she had freed Isabel but at the cost of her own life. Though he had survived, a part of his soul remained trapped in the mansion, along with the memory of what he had lost. After the wife's sacrifice, the mansion fell into peace, but the husband, deeply shaken, felt that something essential had been lost. The house, once haunted, became silent, but he knew that the cost of this tranquility was terrible. Unable to bear the memories, he moved to a small house in the city, living in a state of pain and guilt, haunted by his wife's sacrifice. One day he came across a new portrait in an antique store that evoked the same terror he had felt in the mansion. Realizing that the curse was still lurking, the man decided to dedicate his life to preventing others from falling into the same trap. Aware that the terror still lurked, he became the guardian of this dark secret, battling against a force that should not exist in the world. A 24-year-old man lives quietly in a cozy apartment in a calm neighborhood, where he has found independence and comfort since moving in at 22. With his loyal dog by his side, he enjoys a peaceful routine, supported by a stable job and surrounded by a carefully decorated environment that reflects his tranquil personality. Despite the serenity, there is an invisible tension in the air, as if the apartment harbors a secret yet to be uncovered. On a night that begins like any other, the young man relaxes in his refuge, unaware that the peace of his life is about to be shaken, revealing a dark and unexpected side of his home. Night falls and the rain begins to softly patter against the windows, intensifying the feeling of comfort inside the apartment. The young man, enjoying his day off, indulges in the simple pleasure of being at home. He settles on the couch, feeling the warmth that emanates from the surroundings, while the sound of the rain outside seems almost hypnotic, inviting tranquility. Inside, everything is in perfect order. The soft light of a lamp illuminates the room, books are carefully stacked on the shelf, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee still lingers in the air. He appreciates these moments when the outside world seems distant and irrelevant, and everything that matters is within these four walls. The peace of the night envelopes him, and he loses himself in his thoughts, allowing the calm to seep deep into his being. Beside him, his loyal dog sleeps peacefully with rhythmic breathing and closed eyes. The young man takes one last glance at the clock, noticing that it's late, almost time to get ready for bed. But as he prepares to end the night, something unusual happens. The dog, who had been in a deep sleep, starts to stir, oscillating between sleep and wakefulness as if something had disturbed his peace. He watches his companion with casual curiosity, not giving much thought to the change in behavior. After all, it's just a night like any other, or perhaps not. The soft sound of rain fills the room, but the tranquility in the apartment begins to unravel. The young man notices his normally calm dog suddenly get up with an alert expression. The animal slowly walks to the back door and stops as if waiting for something. Intrigued, the young man follows, realizing that the dog's uneasiness is not just because of the rain. The dog stares intently at the door, focused on something outside that the young man cannot see. A shiver runs down the young man's spine as the once comforting silence becomes oppressive. He decides to open the door, but the dog remains on the threshold, sniffing the air cautiously. Hesitant, the dog finally steps into the yard as if expecting to find something. The young man feels a growing sense of discomfort and a shadow of fear begins to form, sensing that something terrible is about to happen. The rain continues to fall, forming small puddles in the yard as the young man watches his dog, now more agitated, sniffing the air nervously. There is an obvious unease in every movement of the animal, which awakens a growing fear in the young man's chest. Suddenly, the dog stops, its body stiffens and it fixes its gaze in a specific direction. Intrigued and worried, the young man follows the dog's gaze, trying to identify what could be scaring his companion so much. In the darkness of the yard, at the edge between the faint light emanating from the house and the shadow outside, he notices a figure standing still. At first, the young man can hardly believe what he sees, his mind trying to deny the reality before him. However, there, on the other side of the window, is a man, motionless, watching. The stranger's eyes seem fixed on the young man, or perhaps on his dog, but the sinister presence of the man is undeniable. The fear that grips the young man is immediate and profound, like a punch to the stomach. The stranger does not move, remaining there like a menacing shadow, causing the young man's heart to race, his heartbeat echoing in his ears and drowning out even the sound of the rain. Overcome with panic, the young man slowly backs away, trying to process the situation as his mind desperately searches for a solution. The need to protect himself and his home takes over. With trembling hands, he quickly shuts the backyard door, locks all the windows and rushes to lower the blinds, each movement made with urgency and fear. The vision of the man at the window replays in his mind like a nightmare. He doesn't know who the stranger is or what he wants, but one thing is certain. The comfort and safety he once felt in his home vanished in an instant, leaving only fear and uncertainty about what might happen next. The young man moves through the house in a silent frenzy, locking doors and windows, while the sound of the rain outside grows louder and more deafening, heightening his anxiety. He tries to listen beyond the noise of the rain, but all he can hear is the pounding of his heart and the heavy breathing of his dog, who is now calmer but still alert by his side. Sitting on the edge of the sofa, he fixes his gaze on the front door, waiting and listening for any sound that might indicate the stranger's presence outside. The apartment, once his refuge, now feels like a prison, with every shadow and creak of the wood suggesting a hidden threat. Although the dog is lying beside him, its eyes continue to scan the room, alert to something the young man cannot detect. Trying to calm himself, he thinks that maybe the man has left, but doubt lingers. The feeling of helplessness suffocates him as the uncertainty of a possible intrusion eats away at him. Every sound and shadow movement makes him jump, and he remains vigilant, knowing he must be ready for anything. But the truth is he is alone, trapped in the darkness of his own home, waiting in fear for what might come next. In the middle of the night, the young man wakes abruptly, seized by immediate and inexplicable fear. His dog, alert, stares intently at the bedroom door, while an almost absolute silence reigns in the house, broken only by the rain outside. Then he hears it, low murmured voices coming from downstairs. His home has been invaded. Panic takes hold of him and he rises silently, trying to think quickly. The sound of the voices becomes clearer and closer as the intruders rummage through his house. Feeling violated and terrified, the young man decides to hide but knows he must protect his dog. He grabs the dog and moves slowly toward the closet, avoiding any noise. The pressure builds with each step and finally he hides inside the closet, gently closing the door. With the dog crouched beside him, the young man holds on tightly, trying to project a calm he doesn't feel as the intruder's footsteps draw nearer. Trapped in the suffocating darkness of the closet, he holds his breath, waiting and listening, fearing that the next sound will be footsteps approaching where he hides. Time seems to drag on as the young man remains hidden in the closet, listening to the intruders moving through the house, each noise amplifying his terror. His dog, beside him, stays completely silent, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Suddenly he hears sirens in the distance. A momentary sense of relief washes over him, but the worry remains as the intruders are still there. Soon, hurried footsteps indicate that they've noticed the approaching police and begin to flee. The young man, still clutching his dog, listens as the footsteps fade away until silence returns. Cautiously, he steps out of the closet, his heart still racing, and walks through the dark hallway to the living room. There he notices the blinds are slightly open, and the front door, once locked, is now wide open. The flashing lights of police cars reflect on the walls, bringing a mix of relief and exhaustion. The police enter, checking the house to ensure the intruders are gone. The young man, still shaken, watches as the officers work. Though he is safe for now, the feeling of vulnerability lingers. Sitting on the couch, he tries to process what happened, while his dog rests its head on his lap, offering comfort. Despite the temporary safety, he knows that the peace has been shattered, and the lingering fear will not fade easily. As the hours pass, the young man's adrenaline begins to subside, leaving him exhausted. He watches the police wrap up their notes, while the sound of rain continues outside. The apartment, once cozy, is now disordered and marked by the invasion, reinforcing the sense of violation. He gives his statement in a voice he barely recognizes, the words coming out automatically while his mind wanders through dark thoughts, imagining what could have happened if he hadn't woken up. When the police leave, promising to continue the search for the intruders, the young man feels empty and alone. The apartment, which had always been his refuge, now feels different, full of invisible threats. Sitting on the couch with his dog beside him, he tries to reconnect with the place he once called home, but the sense of security has been replaced by constant vigilance and a painful awareness of his vulnerability. He reflects on how everything changed in just a few hours, grateful for the quick response of the police, but the persistent fear remains with him. Something inside him has changed forever, and he's unsure if tranquility will ever return. As the night wears on, he decides that he won't be able to sleep. Instead, he stays awake, petting his dog for comfort. The rain subsides, but inside his chest, the storm of emotion still rages, leaving him with a new understanding of the fragility of safety. The clock struck 3 a.m. as he unlocked the door of the small convenience store, feeling the cold winter air cut across his face. The steady drizzle seemed to wrap the world in a blanket of silence, leaving the streets deserted and the dim shop windows as witnesses to a night that promised to be as quiet as the ones before. The routine was familiar by now, shelves neatly arranged, coffee brewing in the back of the store, and the expectation of yet another uneventful shift. In that place, between the gentle sound of rain and the low hum of fluorescent lights, there was a certain peace, a calmness he almost dared to call safety. But there was something different about this night. Perhaps it was the sharper cold or maybe the silence, which instead of soothing began to feel unsettling. He couldn't quite explain it, but something lingered in the air. Outside, the parking lot was empty, except for a car he noticed for the first time as his eyes scanned the window. It wasn't common to see vehicles parked at that hour, especially with no one in sight. He brushed off the thought momentarily, focusing on his usual tasks, but the presence of that car continued to nag at the back of his mind, like a small, persistent seed of worry. And so the shift began, but the peace he expected that night was about to be challenged. The early morning hours dragged on slowly, and the silence outside was broken only by the soft sound of rain hitting the asphalt. Inside the store, he busied himself with small tasks, almost on autopilot, while enjoying the tranquility of the hour. The empty streets, with streetlights reflected in the puddles, gave a sense of isolation but also a strange calm. When he looked out the window once more, he saw the car parked in the darkest corner of the parking lot. The lights were off and no movement was visible inside or around the vehicle. This stirred something in him, a small unease that began to take root. He couldn't understand why that car was there, parked with no one getting in or out. With each passing minute, the thought returned, insistent, as he tried to push it aside by focusing on work. But the image of the car remained, a shadow at the edge of his vision, a presence that, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, began to disturb the calm of that early morning. Something didn't feel right, and although he still tried to convince himself otherwise, the discomfort inside him started to grow. The unease that had started as a slight discomfort was now impossible to ignore. Every time he looked out the window, the car was still there, unmoving like a dense shadow in the darkness of the parking lot. The fact that no one had gotten in or out of that vehicle deeply disturbed him, turning his thoughts increasingly grim. He approached the window, trying to get a better look through the rain that still fell incessantly, but the droplets streaming down the glass and the darkness outside made it difficult to see. The car remained in the same spot, now with its lights completely off. It seemed abandoned, but his instinct told him otherwise. Something wasn't right, and this certainty began to pulse within him, making his heart beat faster. The store, usually a refuge of safety and routine, now felt like a place of vulnerability. The silence, once so comforting, now weighed heavily, laden with a suspense he couldn't shake. He tried to busy himself with anything, but his eyes kept drifting back to the window, to that car, to the mystery forming in the parking lot. The rain intensified the atmosphere, making the environment even more suffocating. Each drop seemed to mark the passing time, and with it, the tension grew. What had begun as a quiet night at work was starting to turn into something much more unsettling. Something was about to happen, and he could feel it in every fiber of his being. The weight of tension became unbearable. He needed to do something to dissipate that suffocating feeling. He decided to step outside to take out the trash, perhaps hoping the cold air would clear his mind. He opened the back door, feeling the fine rain wet his face, and walked briskly to the dumpster, trying to ignore the mysterious car still parked in the dark corner of the parking lot. It was then that he heard it. A strange noise, muffled by the rain but distinct enough to freeze his blood. It was the sound of something breaking, a sharp crack that echoed in the stillness of the early morning. He stopped immediately, his senses on high alert. His heart raced as his eyes scanned the surroundings, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. With hesitant steps, he approached the neighboring store. There he saw it. The door handle was broken, hanging precariously as if it had been forced. Panic began to rise in his throat. There was no more doubt. Something was very wrong. The suspicion he had tried to shake off throughout the shift was now confirmed with terrifying clarity. He hurried back inside his own store, adrenaline surging through him. The environment, once familiar, now felt like a maze of invisible threats. He locked the door behind him, his hands trembling as he tried to think of what to do next. The rain continued to beat against the windows, each drop seeming to mark the rapid pace of his heart. That sound, that broken door handle, everything indicated that the night was far from peaceful. Panic took over his thoughts, but he knew he needed to act quickly. With shaking hands, he locked all the doors of the store, turning the keys with an urgency he had never felt before. Each lock seemed to echo through the empty space, amplifying the sense of confinement and imminent danger. His eyes darted from side to side, trying to catch any sign of movement outside. He grabbed the phone and, with a trembling voice, called the police, explaining what he had seen and the sound he had heard. Every second of waiting while the call connected felt like an eternity. On the other side of the thin wall, where the neighboring store was located, silence reigned, but it was a dense silence, heavy with an invisible threat. He pressed his ear to the wall, trying to catch any sound, but all he heard was the erratic beating of his own heart. Suddenly, a muffled noise. Something, or someone, was moving inside. The tension reached its peak. He knew the burglars were there, and the thought that they could turn against him at any moment paralyzed him with fear. But there was a faint glimmer of hope. In the distance, he began to hear the sound of sirens. The sound that usually meant chaos was now a sign of imminent rescue. The sound of the sirens grew closer, but at the same time, he heard rapid, desperate footsteps on the other side of the wall. The burglars were fleeing, trying to escape before the police arrived. Every movement they made seemed to echo across the floor, blending with the increasing roar of the sirens. He knew the police were near, but each moment of uncertainty stretched time, heightening the anxiety and fear. Relief was palpable but mixed with deep dread. They were so close, and he could only hope that the doors he had locked would be enough to keep them out until the police finally arrived. As the sirens finally pierced the early morning air, announcing the arrival of the police, the blue and red lights flashed against the shop windows, creating dancing shadows inside the convenience store. He let out a trembling sigh of relief but still didn't dare to move, his eyes fixed on the locked door and the window panes, waiting for any sign that the thieves might attempt something desperate. Outside, the police quickly spread out, surrounding the area with weapons drawn and calculated movements. He knew he was safe now, but the fear still lingered, and the adrenaline still surged through his veins. Watching the activity, he felt some of the tension ease as he saw the officers beginning to check every corner, every shadow. He finally opened the door of his store and stepped outside to meet the officers, the cold night air colliding with his sweaty face. As he approached the officers, he tried to explain what he had seen and heard, his voice still laden with nervousness. While he spoke, the officers took notes, casting quick glances at the mysterious car and the neighboring store, where the doors were now wide open. The thieves, however, had managed to escape, disappearing into the darkness before the police could catch them. But their escape was not clean. Upon investigating the area, the officers found a weapon left behind, along with other items indicating the real danger he had faced. It was clear evidence that the situation could have been much worse. Even with the police there, the feeling of vulnerability didn't completely leave him. The sight of the abandoned weapon sent a chill down his spine, a reminder of how close he had come to danger. Now, looking at the scene, he realized how fragile the security he had always taken for granted was. The night, which had begun like any other, ended with a different weight, a shadow of alertness that he knew he would carry for a long time. As the sirens finally pierced the early morning air, announcing the arrival of the police, the blue and red lights flashed against the shop windows, creating dancing shadows inside the convenience store. He let out a trembling sigh of relief but still didn't dare to move, his eyes fixed on the locked door and the window panes, waiting for any sign that the thieves might attempt something desperate. Outside, the police quickly spread out, surrounding the area with weapons drawn and calculated movements. He knew he was safe now, but the fear still lingered, and the adrenaline still surged through his veins. Watching the activity, he felt some of the tension ease as he saw the officers beginning to check every corner, every shadow. He finally opened the door of his store and stepped outside to meet the officers, the cold night air colliding with his sweaty face. As he approached the officers, he tried to explain what he had seen and heard, his voice still laden with nervousness. While he spoke, the officers took notes, casting quick glances at the mysterious car and the neighboring store, where the doors were now wide open. The thieves, however, had managed to escape, disappearing into the darkness before the police could catch them. But their escape was not clean. Upon investigating the area, the officers found a weapon left behind, along with other items indicating the real danger he had faced. It was clear evidence that the situation could have been much worse. Even with the police there, the feeling of vulnerability didn't completely leave him. The sight of the abandoned weapon sent a chill down his spine, a reminder of how close he had come to danger. Now, looking at the scene, he realized how fragile the security he had always taken for granted was. The night, which had begun like any other, ended with a different weight, a shadow of alertness that he knew he would carry for a long time. On that Friday night, the rain pounded relentlessly against the windows, creating a disturbing symphony of water droplets that echoed through the empty corridors of the small house. It was a modest home, a simple and solitary place in a less fortunate part of the city. The air inside was heavy, laden with the smell of dampness and old wood, as if time itself had forgotten this place. The plan was to spend the night immersed in online games, accompanied only by the glow of the screen and the distant voices of a few friends. The sound of distant thunder mixed with the constant noise of the rain, creating a perfect atmosphere for isolating oneself from the outside world. Solitude, usually a refuge, seemed to wrap around every corner of the house that night, making it a little darker, a little quieter than usual. As the rain battered the roof, the sense of safety and comfort within the walls of this refuge began to be replaced by something more sinister. It was as if, on this particular night, the house itself was transforming into something more, something that had remained hidden, dormant, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As the night wore on and the rain continued to pound the roof, I was deeply engrossed in the game, my eyes fixed on the screen, my hands moving swiftly on the controls. The voices of my friends, distant yet familiar, echoed in my headphones, bringing a sense of normalcy amidst the storm outside. Everything seemed to be going as usual until, suddenly, an unexpected sound shattered the routine. It was a loud, sharp thud from above, as if something heavy had struck the ceiling. The sound reverberated through the house, vibrating through the walls and floor, and for a brief moment, my heart skipped a beat. Instinctively, I paused the game, removing the headphones to listen more intently, trying to understand what could have caused it. The first thought that crossed my mind was that the rain, now heavier than before, might have caused some sort of leak or damage to the roof. With my heart still racing, I hesitated but eventually got up to investigate. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silence of the house, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, expecting to see some sign of water or damage. But when I reached the upper floor, I found nothing. Everything was in its place, untouched as it should be. The sound, so clear and disturbing moments before, now seemed like it could have been just my imagination. Still, the unease that had started to grow inside me didn't fade away. I returned to my game, trying to convince myself that it was just the storm, maybe a branch falling or some other mundane noise amplified by my mind. But no matter how much I tried to focus, something within me had shifted, as if that thud on the ceiling had somehow shattered the tranquility I had felt until then. And even though I tried to ignore it, I knew deep down that this night would no longer be like any other. After a while, the laughter and conversations with my friends came to an end, and I logged off, shutting down the game. The house, now completely silent, felt even more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around me. The only sound that remained was the constant drumming of the rain outside. But then, breaking through that silence, another noise disturbed the quiet, a thud, softer this time but still unmistakable. The sound came from above again, and this time, it was even more unsettling. The unease that had been building inside me earlier intensified. Something wasn't right, and I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Unsure of what I might find, I decided to investigate once more. Each step I took felt heavier, as if the air around me was thickening, growing denser with every passing second. I checked the upper floor again, carefully searching every corner, looking for any sign of what could be causing those sounds. But just like before, I found nothing out of place. The tension inside me continued to grow, the feeling that something was terribly wrong becoming impossible to shake. I then made a decision I'd never considered before. I stepped out into the rain to inspect the house from the outside, hoping to find some clue, anything that could explain those noises. Outside, the cold rain soaked through my clothes as I walked around the house, straining to see through the darkness and the mist formed by the water. And that's when I saw it, a high window almost hidden behind the branches of the large tree next to the house. It was a window I had never noticed before, an opening that seemed to lead to a space above the ceiling, a space I didn't know existed. The initial shock gave way to a growing, uneasy curiosity. That window suggested the existence of an attic, a space I had never explored or even known about in the house. The mystery deepened, and with it, so did the fear of the unknown. I knew I had to go back inside and discover what was really happening. Something was hidden up there, something that had started to reveal itself little by little on that dreadful night. With my heart pounding in my chest and rain still dripping down my face, I re-entered the house, determined to uncover what was going on in that hidden space. The idea of an attic, a place unknown and lurking just above me, filled me with a deep sense of unease, as if something had been watching, waiting in the shadows, biding its time. I began to search for the entrance to this hidden space, meticulously combing through every corner, every detail I might have overlooked. The house, which I had thought I knew so well, now seemed full of secrets, with every shadow potentially hiding something sinister. Then, in the bedroom closet, my eyes landed on something I had never noticed before. A hatch in the ceiling, concealed by dust and shadows, almost invisible. My heart raced. It was as if the house was daring me, challenging me to discover what lay above. With a mix of fear and determination, I grabbed a chair and reached up to the hatch. When I opened it, a foul, damp smell immediately filled the room, a stench that turned my stomach. Above, the space was cramped and dark, as if the very air was saturated with something malevolent. I climbed the small ladder, feeling the wooden floorboards creak under my weight. The darkness was nearly total, with only a faint light from the high window casting weak, eerie shadows across the space. The attic was small, claustrophobic, thick with cobwebs and years of accumulated dust. With each step I took in that confined space, the sense that something was terribly wrong grew stronger, as if the very walls were closing in, alive with a silent, waiting presence. And then, at the far end of the attic, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the darkness, something moved. For a brief moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, it was real. A figure was crouched on all fours, still yet clearly watching me. The darkness couldn't fully conceal its presence, and the faint light revealed something that should not have been there, something inhuman. Fear gripped me, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But for a moment I was paralyzed, frozen in place, staring at this thing that should not exist. When I finally managed to force myself to descend the ladder, I nearly tumbled in my haste to escape. The house, once my refuge, had become a trap, and I needed to get out before it was too late. Terrified, I nearly stumbled as I raced down the ladder, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Panic had taken hold of me completely, and all I could think about was getting as far away from that house as possible. The thing I had seen up there, crouched in the darkness, was something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist, yet it was real and it was watching me. When my feet finally hit the ground, my hands were trembling so violently that I almost couldn't close the hatch above me, but some primal instinct made me slam it shut, as if that could somehow contain the horror lurking in the attic. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever was up there was real and it was waiting, watching. I bolted out of the house, the cold rain immediately soaking me to the bone, but the chill outside was nothing compared to the cold dread that gripped my heart. The image of that figure, distorted and inhuman, was burned into my mind, and I could feel its gaze even now, out here in the open. My hands fumbled for my phone, and with shaking fingers, I dialed the police, barely able to form the words as I tried to explain what I had seen. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. Each minute dragged on, as if time itself was conspiring to prolong my terror. When they finally arrived, the rain was still pouring down, and I stood there, soaked and shaking, unable to do more than point toward the house, my voice failing me. The officers, skeptical but concerned by my obvious distress, entered the house, flashlights and weapons at the ready. I stayed outside, pacing in the rain, my ears straining to catch any sound, any indication of what was happening inside. But the storm drowned out everything, and all I could do was wait, my mind racing with fear and anticipation. When the officers emerged, the horror etched on their faces confirmed what I had feared most. What I had seen was no hallucination. They had found someone, a skeletal, filthy figure, crouched exactly as I had seen it, watching them with the same unnerving intensity. But it wasn't a monster, it was a man. A man who had invaded my home, climbed up the tree beside the house, and hidden in the attic, living in the shadows, watching me. The relief I felt at knowing it was just a man was quickly replaced by a deeper, more visceral fear. He had been there for days, maybe weeks, living above me, moving silently through the house without my knowledge. The realization that he could have come down at any moment, that he had been observing me while I slept, while I lived my life unaware, was utterly horrifying. The reality of a man hiding in my attic, unseen and uninvited, was in some ways more terrifying than any creature of the imagination. Seeing the police lead that man out of my house was both a relief and a new source of terror. He was real, not some figment of my imagination or a shadowy monster from a nightmare. The figure I had seen crouching in the dark attic, staring at me with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, was now in handcuffs, but the fear he instilled in me didn't disappear with his capture. The officers, their faces serious and their voices laced with concern, explained that he was a homeless man who had somehow found refuge in my home. He had climbed the tree outside, entered through that hidden window and made his way into the attic, a place I never even knew existed. He had been living up there, above me in the darkness, observing my every move, waiting for, what? I didn't even want to think about it. Learning that he had been there for at least a week was a shock that I could hardly process. Every night I had spent peacefully, believing I was alone and safe, he had been there, crouched in the shadows, unnoticed. The sense of violation was overwhelming, a deep, unsettling discomfort that I couldn't shake. The house I had called home, my refuge from the world, now felt corrupted, a place that could never offer me safety again. The officers assured me that he likely hadn't intended to harm me, that he was just looking for shelter. But that did little to ease the terror I felt. The thought that he could have come down at any time, that he had been watching me while I slept, while I went about my daily life unaware of his presence, was unbearable. The reality of it all, of living so close to danger without ever knowing, left me in a state of shock, unable to fully grasp what had happened. When the police finally left, taking him away, I stood alone in the rain, staring at the house that now felt alien, hostile. I knew I couldn't stay. The idea of re-entering that place, of sleeping under that roof, knowing what had happened, was inconceivable. Inside me, a decision began to take shape. I needed to leave, to put that house and everything it now represented behind me. There was no way I could continue living there, not after knowing that for so long, I had been anything but alone. The image of that man in the attic, his eyes fixed on me in the darkness, would haunt me forever, a memory that would follow me wherever I went. But at least, far away from that house, I could start to rebuild my sense of safety, to believe once more that my home could be a sanctuary, not a trap waiting to be sprung. After that night, leaving the house became inevitable. The walls that once offered comfort now seemed to close in on me, each room a reminder of the horror I had faced. What was once a refuge had turned into a symbol of silent terror, lurking in the everyday, hidden in the familiar. I moved out quickly, leaving behind not just the furniture and belongings, but also the dark memories that now filled that space. Every night I had spent there, every moment of supposed peace, was now tainted by the knowledge that something had been watching, unnoticed, from above. The simple act of lying down to sleep, of closing my eyes, became impossible, haunted by the image of that man in the attic, his gaze locked on me from the shadows. But even after the move, the feeling of being watched never fully left me. In the new walls that surrounded me, the shadows seemed a little darker, the sounds of the night a little more menacing. I found myself checking windows and doors multiple times before trying to sleep, listening intently for any unfamiliar sound. The thought that something, or someone, could be hidden, observing, became a constant, gnawing paranoia. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that it was all over, but the truth was that the experience had changed me. My sense of security, of privacy, had been irrevocably shattered. The image of that man, crouched in the dark attic, still haunted my dreams, a constant reminder that true terror doesn't always come from fantastical creatures or the supernatural. Sometimes, the real horror lies in the ordinary, in the people who exist on the edges of our awareness, in the presences we never suspect until it's too late. And so, life moved on, but never with the same peace as before. The memory of that night became a scar, a permanent mark that taught me to look twice at what seems familiar, to never underestimate the secrets that can hide in the most unexpected places. Even now, in a new home with different surroundings, the fear lingers, a silent ghost that accompanies me, always reminding me that the true darkness may be closer than we imagine.